Cucks? It's your boy the Hater, and for today's video, I wanted to talk about Japanese wrestling. That's right, motherfucks. Japanese wrestling, and how Japanese wrestling ruined regular wrestling that we had here in the States. Now, obviously, the blame does not fall on the Japanese wrestling companies who don't know any better, and all they're trying to do is make some money. You know what I mean? That's like their prerogative. It's understandable. I can't really blame them, you know? But, nevertheless, cucks, these companies are what ruined wrestling for the rest of us. Now, how did they accomplish this? Well, I'll tell you how. First of all, they took the medium of wrestling and changed it significantly to something else, right? Wrestling is no longer wrestling in Japan. In Japan, they have puroresu, or puro, as we say here in America, right? Which is actually just a transliteration of the word pro wrestling, right? So that's how they pronounce it. They go puroresu, like puro wrestling, basically, cucks. But the difference between this type of wrestling and our type of wrestling is that they pretty much scaled down all the things that make wrestling fun, and they scaled up all the things that make wrestling stupid, right? So one thing they scaled up is they completely changed the flow of matches so that now people do these ridiculously dangerous moves, and people have to like take these ridiculously dangerous moves. They took away all the exciting stuff, all the fun stuff, cucks, all the stuff that includes things like promos and storylines, and basically their philosophy is that the story is told through the match, right? This is why when you hear nowadays things like, oh, in-ring psychology, like Kenta Kobashi's in-ring psychology is amazing, right? All Japanese wrestling matches have one psychology, one story, right? One thing is being told. There's one guy who perseveres and shows fighting spirit. This is why they kick out of like 19 finishers. Now, fortunately for them, their finishers in Japan are things like clotheslines and vertical suplexes, right? So like, you know, like it's kind of bad. So it's not really that big of a deal, right? Whereas in the WWE, or WWF I should say, and WCW during this time, people had actual good wrestling moves. Now, not all of them, right? Like, I mean, I think we can all agree that, you know, the Hulk Hogan leg drop is not exactly like the best move of all time, right? But after that, during the Attitude Era, people started having finishing moves, and just moves in general, that are commensurate with their characters. But, you know, that was not the end of it, right? But it was kind of a nice big bookmark in the history of wrestling. Nobody really cared about Japanese wrestling except for like Dave Meltzer, right? They're like, oh, Minami Honda is fighting like Mitsurugi Toyota in like an 8-star classic. Like nobody gives a shit, right? People were too busy watching things like Triple H, Eddie Guerrero, S.A. Rios, you know, and others, right? And the few good Japanese wrestlers found their way to the States, like Taka Michinoku, you know, Tajiri, and a few other ones, but mostly those guys, right? Now, with all that being said, cucks, what happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. At some point, wrestling got pretty boring in the United States, let's be honest, right? This is like the Cena era, right? Like, I like Cena, but that time was not fun, right? Because, quite honestly and quite ironically, they inadvertently copied the entire formula of Japanese wrestling, right? Cena became the guy that perpetually and continuously overcomes the odds, beating people that he shouldn't be beating, right? For the same reasons that wrestling sucks today, it started to suck back then too, right? Because people like Cena were beating people like Big Show like he's nothing. They're beating people like fucking, you know, let's see, like fucking Great Khali, you know, these monsters as well as legends, right? Cena was beating everybody. Now, with all that being said, I mean, that's not that big of a deal, right? It's still John Cena. Like, he's at least believable. But this did turn off a lot of fans, right? Fans turned on Cena, and, you know, obviously the mainstream fans had already stopped watching, right? They stopped watching when, like, Stone Cold and The Rock left. But, you know, nevertheless, some of them were still around. But now a lot of other fans basically developed this weird attitude, right? And part of it is also the fact that, you know, we also had things like TNA. You know what I'm saying? TNA also helped. But it wasn't just TNA, you know? ROH, a bunch of other indie feds started popping up. And people, once they got bored with those things, they're like, oh, well, what can we watch now? So, and I was one of these people. I never really bought into it, but I was one of them. Like, I would Google. I'd be like, okay, wrestling, right? And eventually, you would exhaust all the reasonable United States wrestling promotions, right? Because it's like, ROH, you could maybe, if you're lucky, you could have watched a show here and there. But it's really hard to watch this kind of stuff back then, right? But New Japan, they had like a good online presence, and people started watching New Japan, right? This was also fueled by people like Dave Meltzer, who kept saying how good New Japan is, right? So you're like, okay, nobody ever talks about this, so it must be good. But the difference is this, right? Most people watch this shit like once or twice, and they're like, yeah, this isn't good, right? Like, I'll give you an example myself. I tuned in to watch Okada versus, Tanahashi, right? And I'm like, this is what people were losing their mind about? This is fucking Okado, who I last remember getting his ass beat by Elijah Burke, or D'Angelo Dinero, rather, in TNA. D'Angelo Dinero slapping him and taking off his stupid-ass Kato mask, right? That's what I remember from him. So I'm like, this guy's a main eventer now? All right, let's give it a shot, right? I'm open-minded. I'm willing to give everything a shot. Then it's him versus Tanahashi, who at least looks like a wrestler, right? Then I realized that the things that people were marking out for were stupid, right? Like Tanahashi's finishing move, the high fly flow. I think it's called the high flow fly, something like that, right? The words high, fly, and flow are involved in the name. Like, Tanahashi is out there, and he's basically hitting diving cross bodies. And that's his fucking finisher. It's a diving cross body. Then he does it again, but this time it's a frog splash, and it has the same name, which actually kind of makes sense, because it's the same thing. He's doing the same thing. Whether you hit it on like a standing opponent or a, laying down opponent, it's still a frog splash. It's still the same thing, right? You can call it a cross body, but it's the same thing. So he does these things like 10 times, and then eventually he beats Okada. At some point, Okada also goes for his finisher, which is this ripcord clothesline. And I'm like, this guy's like skinny fat. I mean, and he's doing a clothesline finisher. So people like me were like, fuck this, I'm not watching this again, right? At some other juncture, I think it was the same pay-per-view because I only watched one. It was Nakamura versus AJ Styles. So I watched it for AJ Styles. I'm like, oh shit, it's AJ Styles, right? And then it's like Nakamura, AJ Styles. Nakamura does 3 moves the entire time. AJ Styles is pretty much carrying this jobber completely, right? And then Nakamura wins by hitting a knee. And I'm like, this is the guy that they're telling me is a good wrestler? What's his gimmick? What is his gimmick? I thought he was some sort of drunk. I thought Nakamura's gimmick was that he's like the town drunk. He's always acting retarded. Like, I'm not even exaggerating, right? And then after Tanahashi wins the main event, he cuts this 20-second speech. Then he jumps in the air and he starts pretending to play the guitar. He's playing the air guitar. And I'm like, oh, his gimmick is he's a pretend rock star? I don't understand what the fuck is happening here, right? And then the more you watch, right? Because one of my friends was watching once and he's like, yo, come watch this. And it was like Jericho versus Naito. And I tell him, I'm like, bro, Jericho is too good for this shit. Like, he's like next to Naito, Jericho looks like Goldberg, you know what I mean? But anyways, Jericho beats Naito and my friend starts marking out. And I'm thinking, like, what are you marking out for? Like, Jericho became like the New Japan Intercontinental Champion. Like, who gives a flying fuck? You know what I mean? Like, he's been the real Intercontinental Champion like 100 times. But anyways, the point is, a lot of fans then developed what I call and what people tend to describe as the cultured opinion, right? Now, the cultured opinion is where everything hits the fan, right? It's going to be the topic of the next video, but I'm going to briefly talk about it here, right? People stopped liking wrestling with their brains, and they started liking wrestling with their, for lack of a better term, with their hearts, right? People started liking whatever they were told to like. There's no way in hell that Nakamura has ever made anybody feel something in a wrestling ring, right? Never. You never watched Nakamura and thought to yourself, wow, like, I really want this guy to win. Like, why? Why would you want Nakamura to win? Like, what is it about Nakamura that makes him better in your eyes than, let's say, Drew Gulak, right? It's definitely not the personality or charisma, because Nakamura has the personality or charisma. As a matter of fact, I still don't know what his gimmick is. Oh, the artist. Like, what do you mean the artist? What the fuck? What's the art? Doing 3 moves? Oh, great. Then I guess Goldberg was an artist too. Because that's the biggest criticism of Goldberg. It's, oh, Goldberg only does 3 moves. Yeah, so what, motherfucks? He doesn't need to do more than 3 moves. He's Goldberg. Nakamura needs to do 100 moves because he's skinny fat. But anyways, I digress. The point is, the cultured opinion is what came up out of this, right? And for that, we'll do a different video. So with that being said, motherfucks, Japan has ruined wrestling. Get wrecked.